Hey everyone, recently while browsing CEX here in the UK I came across this, an ATI 2400XT, or more specifically the 256MB DDR2 version. It was revealed June 28, 2007 and at the time was specifically aimed at the budget segment of the market. It had a core clock of 650MHz and a 500MHz memory clock, which is 1GHz effective as it is DDR2 memory. As said, this was the 256MB DDR2 variant, which will unfortunately bottleneck the card quite heavily. There is however a version with GDDR3 memory, which should perform a bit better than this does. This version though has a 64-bit memory bus width and supports DirectX 10 and OpenGL 3.3. Codenamed RV610, the die features 180 million transistors built on the 65nm fabrication process. It has 40 shader units, 4 texture mapping units, 4 raster operations pipelines, and 2 compute units, all with a TDP of 25 watts. It's currently out of stock at CEX in the UK, but I did however manage to pick it up for only £1, which is $1.30 US, or €1.12. The rest of the system we'll be using with the 2400XT today features an i7 6700K at 4.8 GHz on all 4 cores, with a 4.9 GHz boost happening on 2 cores. This is used to eliminate any potential CPU bottlenecking. A Kraken X61 cooler from NZXT, an MSI Z270 SLI Plus motherboard, 16GB of COrsair Vengeance LPX DDR4 RAM at 2800MHz, and Windows 10 Pro 64-bit. Unfortunately, I'm only able to test 2 games today, GTA San Andreas and Counter-Strike Global Offensive. I did however try to test Grand Theft Auto 5 and Tomb Raider from 2013, but the card unfortunately can't manage these at all, with around 2 frames per second achieved at 1080p in Grand Theft Auto 5, and only around 5 frames per second at 720p. Tomb Raider at 1080p and 720p was pretty much a no-go as well. The first game I tried was Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, which is one of mine and many others' personal favourite GTA games of all time. We'll be running this at both 1080p and 720p on the lowest settings we can. It is based in the fictional US state of San Andreas, which is based on California, with a lot of elements borrowed from Rockstar North's home country of Scotland, and centres around the life of Carl Johnson, or CJ as we know him. It released in 2004 on the PC, so should be relatively easy for the 2400XT to run. However, at 1080p, the game is completely unplayable. FPS did range from 30 to over 40 FPS, but the game suffered from pretty severe micro stuttering throughout gameplay, as you can probably see from the footage. I also noticed some dips into the high 20s, which doesn't really matter when the game stutters as bad as it did during testing. I persevered through the stutter though and managed to get a 15-minute fraps benchmark, which showed 2400XT managing an average of 36 frames per second, with 1% and 0.1% lows of 8 and 6 frames per second respectively. There was also one occasion where there was a massive 3000 plus millisecond gap between frames, which you can see from the frame time graph on screen now. 720p was by far easier to run than 1080p was for the 2400, but it did still have its issues. It did manage to range from the high 40s all the way to nearly 70 frames per second at times, but the micro stutter the 1080p exhibited was still there, albeit not as bad. I managed to get a fraps benchmark which showed an average of 57 frames per second, with 1% and 0.1% lows of 14 and 9 frames per second respectively. I'd personally say it was playable for the most part, but as you can see from the frame time graph here, there was one occasion in which the game pretty much froze for nearly 2800 milliseconds, with stutter of around half a second happening elsewhere. I also had a go at Counter-Strike Global Offensive, or CSGO as it's more commonly known, a game which admittedly I've never played before today, so you can expect some pretty awful gameplay from myself, even though I only played against medium difficulty bots, so please don't hate me. It initially released in August 2012, but 6 years on is still being updated and to this day remains one of the most popular games out right now, with a massive professional scene as well. For the vast majority of games, 1080p will always be a no-go for a card such as the 2400XT, but I'll be running this at 1080p as well as 720p anyway. For the test today, I'll be doing the match against the in-game bots on the Mirage map. At 1080p, the 2400XT performed pretty badly to say the least. The FPS was under 15 most of the time, and tanked well into the single figures when smoke grenades were used, with severe stutter happening with the smoke on screen. Aiming is extremely difficult as well, and it's not just down to me being crap. And overall, the game is pretty hard to play, even against the bots. Did however get a fraps benchmark, which showed an average of 19 frames per second, with 1% and 0.1% lows, 10 and 8 frames per second respectively, with the frame time graph showing just how much the frame times vary throughout gameplay. 720p was kind of playable at times, but again suffered from stutter throughout. The 2400 managed to get over 30 frames per second, but on occasions dipped under 20, making for some really jarring gameplay. A 15-minute Fraps benchmark showed an average of 38 frames per second, with 1% and 0.1% lows of 18 and 14 frames per second respectively. The frame time graph shows several stutters of nearly a tenth of a second, which will be noticeable during gameplay, so it's entirely up to you if you can put up with it or not. Personally, I wouldn't mind it too much, as I actually still had fun during this test. Overclocking wise, I managed to push the card pretty far over its stock 650MHz, with a final stable figure of 790MHz being achieved, a 21.53% increase in core clock. However, considering that this version of the 2400XT is a DDR2 variant and not the GDDR3 version, it is extremely memory bottlenecked, so overclocking the core won't make a meaningful difference at all. Memory wise though, I only managed to get another 67MHz out of it, for a total of 567MHz, or 1134MHz effective. With GTA San Andreas, I managed a clock of 797MHz on the core, but this unfortunately wasn't stable for Counter-Strike Go. With Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, at 1080p there was no difference whatsoever. The exact same issues still remained, and the game was just as stuttery as before. A Fraps benchmark showed that it achieved exactly the same results as its stock, with an average of 36 frames per second, with 1% and 0.1% lows of 8 and 6 frames per second respectively. The frame time graph, however, does show that the lockups weren't as severe, with the biggest being just over half a second. Still pretty bad, but not as bad as the 3+ second lockup the stock clocks exhibited. 720p for an overclock was a noticeable improvement over stock. FPS ranged from 45 to 80 frames per second throughout, and at times maintained over 60 frames per second. There was still some micro stutter though, but the majority of the time the game ran reasonably smooth. A Fraps benchmark showed an average of 64 frames per second, with 1% and 0.1% lows of 18 and 12 frames per second respectively. I would definitely call this playable, as long as you're able to put up with occasional stutter. The frame time graph, however, did show a single spike in frame times of around 13 seconds, but I'm fairly certain I had alt-tabbed out of the game at this point, as I would have noticed a lockup that bad. Moving on to CSGO, and as I said previously, I had to drop down to 790MHz on the core for this to be stable. At 1080p, the overclock unfortunately did nothing to how playable the game was at this resolution. FPS had creeped up to around 20, but the gameplay was still pretty jarring, and smoke still made the game go under 10 frames per second. Input lag, as with stock, was an issue here as well, as it took around half a second for movements of the mouse to translate into something happening on a screen, making gameplay pretty much impossible. A Fraps benchmark showed an average of 24 frames per second, with 1% and 0.1% lows of 12 and 9 frames per second respectively. You can see from the frame time graph just how bad the stutter was throughout, with spikes of over a tenth of a second happening quite regularly. At 720p however, the game was actually quite fun to play. It did still suffer from some stutter, but this didn't happen often enough to really be noticeable. FPS ranged between 30 to 50 throughout the game, but did on occasion drop under that, with figures close to 20. However, for the most part, the 2400XT did manage to maintain at least 30 frames per second, making it a relatively playable experience. A Fraps benchmark showed an average of 45 frames per second, with 1% and 0.1% lows of 22 and 17 frames per second respectively. The frame time graph does show some stutter, with frame times of nearly 1/10 of a second happening occasionally, but as said previously, it's barely noticeable as it doesn't happen that often. Overall, I personally wouldn't recommend that you buy this card at all. Any and all relatively modern games are a complete no-go for a 2400XT, and even Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, a 14-year-old game at this point, was a struggle at times. However, if you're only looking to play games like Grand Theft Auto San Andreas and older at no more than 720p, then you'd probably be okay. I would still recommend you buy something much newer and much faster at this point though. You don't even have to shell out that much cash to do so. Although, considering the 2400XT only cost me £1, it was quite a fun card to play about with. At some point in the future though, I am planning on volt modding the 2400XT, just to see how much more performance I can get out of it with higher voltages, as you can actually change them through software. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking it and sharing it, and leaving a comment on it as well. You could also consider subscribing to my channel if you'd like more content like this in the future. Hopefully you'll tune in for the next one.